All right, you guys have heard us talk plenty of quarterbacks in relation to the Colts recently. That's all we want to talk about. But today we're going to talk to someone who actually studied the Colts' most likely draft pick on a daily basis for the last 3 years. Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Colts, your daily Indianapolis Colts podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, what's up, everybody? Thanks for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. This is your daily podcast covering your Indianapolis Colts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am Jake Arthur, of course, joined today by Brandon Olsen. He covers the Locked On Florida Gators podcast for us. And you guys, we obviously love all the Anthony Richardson talk that we can take. But, Zach and I, we don't cover Florida all the time. We've done our research, as he becomes a prospect and gets a hotter name. But Brandon here has covered Richardson's Florida career since 2020. So we figured it was time to get a different perspective, someone who's probably studied at a little more molecular level for a while. So, Brandon, thanks for joining in, man.
I will go anywhere that I'm allowed to talk Anthony Richardson. So
that's good to hear because we like to talk about him. Our listeners like to talk about him as well. So, first and foremost, the Colts have been very picky when it comes to quarterbacks. They're kind of getting a gift this year. It's a great year to need one. Lots of talent with these top 4 guys, 5 as well if you throw Hendon Hooker in there. But the best part about it is all of these guys have good heads on their shoulders. They all seem to be good guys, focused on their craft and this and that. That's one of the biggest things the Colts hone in on. How are they as leaders? What are their study and preparation habits, things like that. So can you speak to Richardson as a leader and how he prepares? What's people's perception of him there, from a Gators perspective of how he is as a competitor, basically?
I have never met somebody that said a negative thing about his character. Like you can criticize his play all you want. I have never spoken to somebody who will criticize Anthony Richardson's character. That just doesn't happen. He is one of the hardest workers around. Like Billy Napier, Florida Gators head coach, he demands a lot from his quarterbacks. We're in a quarterback battle right now, and he's openly like, you have to win over your team, your teammates. You have to win over the entire locker room. You have to win over the coaching staff. You have to win over all this to be our starting quarterback. And Anthony Richardson did that with an immense amount of pressure on his shoulders. Like people don't usually consider it, but Anthony Richardson is a Gainesville kid. Like he went to Eastside High School and he was a highly ranked quarterback recruit coming out, and he chose to stay home and go to Florida. And also while he was in high school, he was working on the side in order to help provide for his family because he has to do that. So Anthony Richardson, one of the hardest workers around. And yeah, I've never met anybody that will even consider saying a negative thing about his character.
Yeah, he's obviously not got a huge sample size, of starting experience there. But watching the tape, and even other people have studied him, they've noticed the progress that he made throughout the season. Can you speak to that? Obviously he was a pretty raw, moldable player early on, but by season's end, what kind of player did you see from him?
Yeah, you saw someone that grew and developed. And my favorite thing I think about Anthony Richardson was how he would publicly grow. Like he had multiple times in the season where he would have a bad game and he would come out here and in the press conferences and he'd say, look, I forget how fast these guys are sometimes, and that's why I've had these issues. Or he's been very public where he said, I'm a Gainesville kid. My first start against Utah wasn't great throwing the ball. He made a ton of plays with his legs and he made some big plays. But then he had Kentucky, was one of the worst performances that you've seen from a quarterback. And he publicly was like, look, 90,000 people love me. Like they're all cheering for me. I'm the hometown kid. There's a lot of pressure. And I've screwed up at times. But you watched him grow and develop throughout the course of the season, whether things were good or bad. He was going through, and he shined when he had to. You look at the second half against Tennessee, he played great. You look at Utah, he played great. Even going back to 2021 when he was backing up Emory Jones, you look at the second half of LSU, that game I was certain at halftime was dead. And Anthony Richardson led Florida. I mean, they still did lose, but he led them to a very close comeback. And he's someone that has constantly worked on his craft. You look at him from 2021, the small sample size there is of LSU, Georgia, and then you look at him in 2022, you see a cleaned up passer. He cleaned up his mechanics in that time. He's been working with Denny Thompson over at 6 Points in Jacksonville. He's trying to improve here, and you can see that throughout the year.
That actually brings me to one of my next topics I wanted to tackle with you. So, he's obviously incredibly athletic, blew the roof off the combine with his scores, one of the most athletic quarterbacks we've seen pre-draft. But obviously, relying on your mobility and everything isn't sustainable throughout your whole career. What gives you confidence that he's going to develop into a consistent, effective passer in the NFL?
I think it's mostly that he wants to become an actual passer, an actual dual threat quarterback, where he wanted to maybe get unleashed a little bit in 2022 with the Florida Gators. But head coach Billy Napier has frequently publicly said, we wanted to let Anthony Richardson run free. We wanted to let him run the ball as he wanted to. We wanted to let him do everything he wanted to. But our quarterback situation, depth-wise, was really bad. So we had to do everything we can to kind of protect him and limit him. So when you're looking at an offense that was also very boom or bust, he kept things right near the line of scrimmage, or he was throwing it deep downfield. There wasn't a ton in the intermediate range. So there's things like that where I think if he's given that room to grow that he didn't have, and given that leash, we'll say, that he didn't have in Gainesville, that you'll actually see him grow and develop as it goes on.
That's good. You obviously really like to hear that. And again, the potential there is immense, obviously because of the mobility, but he really has shown some nice things as a passer. There's probably a little more nuance to his game than people think there. But obviously there are some knocks on him as well. Obviously the lack of experience, just 13 starts. But a couple of the big things you also see, a lot of these NFL head coaches like guys that win, obviously. Just a 6-7 record as a starter. The completion percentage is also pretty misleading as well. Career 54.7%. A lot of drops, though, for Florida. When you take into account Florida's record at 6-7, sub 500, and that completion percentage, surely some of it is on him. But how, are those numbers misleading in any way?
Yeah, a little bit there. Like you mentioned, there were a lot of drops with Florida. It's how it was. And I think one thing that he won't get enough credit for is how he evaded pressure as a quarterback. That he did something that I think in the draft class, he's second to only Bryce Young in terms of extending plays with your legs and actually creating room for you to throw the ball. But yeah, there were a lot of drops, and he would try to answer the bell. But you have to understand, this is a Florida team that under the previous regime, they did not care that much about recruiting. I've always said, if you want athletes in college, you go to the state of Florida and you grab some athletes. Dan Mullen didn't do that. That's why they don't have great athletes at receiver. Both of Florida's safeties ran the 4.7s at the combine. There wasn't a ton of talent on that team. Let's just put that. So, yeah, I mean, the numbers are misleading. The win-loss, the offense was statistically pretty good. It was probably the worst Florida Gators defense that I've ever seen, though, in 2022. It's really hard to win games when your team is just bad on defense, when you have bad pass catchers, and the only thing you really have going is an incredibly raw and talented quarterback, good O-line, couple good defensive pieces, and 2 good running backs, where that's not how you win football games in 2022 or 2023.
Yeah, it sounds like he probably could use, a fresh start somewhere with a little stability offensively. I can't say that's the Colts quite yet, but, new head coach Shane Steichen, Jonathan Taylor, that's still a nice gem. Okay, so this is your quarterback. You've seen, at least for the last few months now, since draft season has really started ramping up, people are picking apart each of these guys. So I'll put you on the spot a little bit. Is there something you would want people to know about Richardson that is just completely missing the boat, or there's just something you want people to know that's not being mentioned, basically?
I think the biggest thing, and you kind of talked about it before, where people are assuming things about him that you're not that just aren't true. Like, the nuance to his game, looking off safeties with his eyes, as a guy who Florida Gators fans have commonly been like, he can't throw the ball, just move him to tight end. I understand that he is a freak athlete. There's a reason when you look at mock draftable, his second highest percentage comp from any position is Khalil Mack. I understand he's a physical freak. Like, people like him don't exist. That's the thing. I think you can talk about these raw quarterbacks that are big arm, strong, fast. They can do all these things. People like Anthony Richardson don't exist. And that's what I think is kind of being often overlooked by fans, where you could say his completion percentage, his win-loss, his turnovers early in the season, whatever it is. People his size don't move like he does, because if they do, they play edge rusher like Khalil Mack, and they can't throw the ball 70 yards in the air. Yeah, sometimes couldn't hit the side of a barn if he was throwing the side of a barn. But if you can get Anthony Richardson right and you can get that consistency down, you're getting someone that doesn't exist anywhere else. That's why I've been critical of AR since he was a backup. But from an NFL perspective, if you can add the potential like that to your quarterback room, you do it, especially when you have someone who has such a good head on his shoulders that, yeah, you don't see that on film, but NFL teams are going to figure this out. I mean, the Colts jet was in Gainesville earlier today, so I'm assuming that was his visit, but yeah, he's got a great head on his shoulders, and I think that's something that you won't see on film, but NFL teams will fall in love with him for it.
Yeah, that's one thing that makes him such an intriguing prospect, is his athleticism is really rare, but we always see some players that have crazy athleticism, but it seems like he's got the rest of it to him, the mental makeup and everything, the right attitude. And a lot of Colts fans, I think, have kind of geared up and gotten more on board, because they're in an AFC that is just really heavy at quarterback. And it said you kind of need an alien now to win if you're gonna get anywhere in the playoffs. And it seems like Richardson is pretty much that type of player. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, Brandon. Everybody, if you're not already following Locked On Gators, also follow him on Twitter. He's at WNS_Brandon. Thanks so much for your time, man.
Thank you.
Yeah. Dun, dun, dun. All right, everyone. So we're going to reflect a little bit on what Brandon had to say there here shortly. But first, let's go ahead and tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are finally almost here. Will the Pacers be in it? No, they will not, but they have a bright future anyways, just like we're kind of looking forward to with the Colts. But yeah, it's the perfect time now to download FanDuel, which is America's #1 sports book. For new customers, you guys get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. All you got to do is just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It is safe, secure, and it is super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from money lines to point scores and even threes drained. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So do not miss your chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Okay, everybody. So at this point of the draft, unless something crazy happens and the Colts trade up to number 1 or 2 or something, which I don't think any of us are really under the impression they'll be doing, it's just too rich. And if they were going to do it, they probably would have done it already. But Chris Ballard has already said, basically what Carolina did was going to be too much out of their price range. So going up to 3 seems a little more likely, even if they stay at 4. It really seems like it's down to Will Levis and Anthony Richardson. And we will go into Will Levis a little more, here in these next few weeks. Zach and John Hagler did an episode here recently as well. But at this point, there's really not much about Anthony Richardson that I'm not ready to take on if I'm the Colts. You've got just the sky high ceiling athletically, and yes, he needs to come along a little bit as a passer. And again, he's only had the 13 starts as in college as a starter. But something we've discussed before is he's so good athletically and he's such a dangerous runner that is something that can get him on the field right away. You can get by with him as a runner and then getting the occasional passes in and everything. and kind of rely on him more as a weapon as the passing comes along. But he's not really the type of prospect who it's like he's a huge project. He has to wait 2 years, whatever. He seems like the kind of player who just needs the experience. He's had the 13 games at Florida, but now you just got to get him playing time. I really trust Colts head coach Shane Steichen's past with what he's been able to do with quarterbacks. He's worked with every different kind of quarterback. And in his most recent experience with Jalen Hurts, that's someone who's kind of comparable with Anthony Richardson. Richardson is just even more athletic. Jalen Hurts was by no means a finished product when he hit the field 2 years ago. And now look, a year later, he was second in MVP voting. Is that in Richardson's future? I'm not sure. But someone with those physical traits is already worth investing in and taking a chance on. But then you mix in the fact that he kind of checks off the Colts boxes with his attitude and mentally and his work ethic and everything. They've done a lot of work on him going back from the start of Florida season to now. Like you heard Brandon mention, the Colts are there in Gainesville working out Richardson today. So work ethic, that's something that's really critical to Chris Ballard and Shane Steichen. If there's one thing that gives me pause, it's that he's not the most consistently accurate quarterback right now. He has shown signs of being able to do it, but it's kind of scattershot right now. He just needs to be more consistent. That's something Shane Steichen, I watched an interview with him just earlier. He was on Jason Kelce and Travis Kelce's podcast. And they asked, if you're making a quarterback, what's the most important thing? First thing he said was accuracy. And that is not his most consistent trait, of course. But Shane Steichen has said he thinks that can be taught, that can be developed. And when you have a guy like Richardson who is focused on perfecting his game and getting better, that's all you need. You need someone who has the physical traits and the want to work with. And, man, at this point, I would be all in with the Colts going up to 3 to make sure they secure him, because we're pretty confident that CJ Stroud and Bryce Young are going to be the first 2 players off the board. So if the Colts are really as into Richardson as it looks like they might be, then go up to number 3, get your guy. I don't think moving up one slot in the draft is going to be all that expensive, and quarterback is worth it. If this is your guy for the next decade, dozen years, and you feel that way, then is there really a price that you can put on that? I don't think there is. So yeah, thank you again to Brandon for joining us. Thank you guys for tuning in. We will be back with you guys tomorrow. Zach will be back in as well. I think him and Hag have some stuff cooked up as well. But we're going to keep cracking into draft stuff. Zach actually released his latest mock draft just today. If you guys want to go check that out on horseshoehuddle.com, I think you guys will really like it. Looks like a really good haul for the Colts if they were actually to come away with it. But follow at Locked On Colts, at Jake Arthur NFL, and at Zach Hicks 2 on Twitter. Also subscribe to Locked On Colts on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts. We would be forever indebted to you for your ratings and reviews as well. Your positive ones, your 4 or 5-star ones. Please. But yeah, thank you guys for making us your first listen every day. Now make your second listen the new Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes. From free agency to the draft, salary cap management, and all of that. Join NFL experts Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino as they take you through what it's like to build a successful NFL franchise every Monday through Friday. Find Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And we will see you guys tomorrow.